In a prison visiting room, Hazel Griffin and Glyn Dix fall in love.
Indeed, they were regarded by everyone as being the perfect couple, the lovey-dovey couple.
But what could Hazel really know about the man that she had met behind bars?
He'd stopped taking his medication and became severely mentally ill, psychotic.
Because he has no contact with reality, Glyn Dix did and always does represent a danger to anybody in contact with him.
To me, he's just a bomb waiting to go off.
Has Hazel married a man who was made for murder? Probing the mind and the timeline of killers, this series reveals the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life. It was in 1997 when 47-year-old mum of six Hazel Griffin meets Glyn Dix.
She came to see him. She couldn't resist him.
He was sharing a prison cell with her son, Adam.
Adam had grown to regard Glyn as perhaps his best friend.
Adam is serving time for driving offences. Hazel visits him regularly.
He's formed a friendship with her son, Adam. He appears to her obviously an attractive man, somebody that she's interested in.
So when she starts this relationship with Dix, she's not concerned. She's not concerned about his past. They spark up a relationship.
They end up being pen pals.
Dix was 18 years into a minimum term of 20 years in prison for murder. Yet Hazel seemed to have few qualms about befriending him, given how he appeared.
The confusing thing about someone like Glyn Dix is that you wouldn't pick up in meeting him, in making his acquaintance, anything sinister, threatening, hostile, angry, anything that seemed particularly dangerous about him. And that's because he doesn't have that kind of personality. He's not driven by hatred. He's not driven by anger or really any kind of vindictive agenda or violent urges at all. That's not who Glyn Dix is.
Hazel was soon regularly visiting Dix in prison. And after a few months, she announced to everybody that she was in love and that they were going to get married.
By now, Hazel believes that she knows all that she needs to about the man she's due to marry. He has admitted that in 1980 he was convicted of shooting a young woman, Pia Overbury. But he'd not exactly told the full truth.
Dix has woven a complicated web of lies about himself. There is no mention of the fact that he's in there for life for killing a woman in the manner that he did. He's created this whole persona of himself, which is not reflected in his reality.
In fact, Glyn Dix told Hazel and her family that he had been framed for Pia's murder. It was an outlandish tale.
I think because that trust had already started and been built and, possibly Hazel was a bit vulnerable, that he got away with those stories and presented himself as somebody who was not dangerous at all.
He comes up with some strange story about being in the elite army and that he was involved in this altercation, and when he woke up he had a shotgun in his hand and a woman was dead.
The true story of 32-year-old Pia Overbury's death was much darker than Glyn would have anyone believe.
So we're in the 1970s. We are in Gloucester. Now, Glyn Dix stood out even then as a bit of a local oddity. People remembered him.
Glyn Dix was living alone, a single man in his 20s renting a flat from a young mum, Pia Overbury.
We know as a young man he's living in digs but not paying his rent. Now actually this is our first hint, I think, of just how disorganised and chaotic Glyn Dix's thinking processes actually are.
Glyn Dix was an unreliable tenant. He often paid his rent late, if at all.
This isn't a careless disregard. It's actually somebody whose mind doesn't work effectively, who doesn't really understand how the world works, doesn't understand how other people works. And this is our first hint of him struggling with functioning as an adult. He's just coping moment by moment.
Pia and her young daughters were forced to visit Dix's home to collect his late rent. His behaviour during these visits became increasingly erratic.
Pia's daughter was a young child at the time. Now, she recounts that when they used to go to try and collect rent, on the occasions when he would try and pay it, she would feel very uncomfortable in his presence. He would sometimes make strange faces at her.
I think it's very interesting that while the landlady herself doesn't identify anything sinister about Glyn Dix, her young daughter does find something frightening about him. That's very interesting because actually, in some ways, I think that the type of dangerousness that Glyn Dix presents is something that a child would better understand, would better relate to.
What Pia didn't realise was she was dealing with a ticking time bomb. And by the mere fact of asking to be paid for the rent that was due, she had placed herself very much in the firing line of that time bomb.
Pia is repeatedly frustrating him, causing immense frustration, and yet she won't have been aware of that because she won't have picked up on any of the personality indicators of somebody who is dangerous. So she's putting herself in incredible danger without realising it.
Unwittingly, Pia had ignited a furious rage in Glyn Dix, and he takes a dangerous step.
How dare she? Who does she think she is?
It was at that point he bought a gun.
We do know about people who revere weapons, display weapons, want to use weapons, are more dangerous than other people. So we start to get a picture of this man who likes to dominate, who likes to frighten, and now has an illegal gun.
In the early autumn of 1979, Pia Overbury disappeared. Her daughter, Maxine, wanting to celebrate her birthday, was the first to notice that her mother was missing.
They were going there to have a celebration of some type. However, Pia wasn't there. Now, this was starting to cause some real concern, so they reported her missing.
Pia's husband sensed something was wrong and reported her missing to the police, but they had little to go on. Neil Lancaster is a former police detective experienced in using technology to help trace missing persons, but back then, that was not an option.
There were no telephones to track. Banking information was always way out of date. There was no CCTV, so we were reliant on finding her, just looking for her. There were no leads. Now, I have to say that in those days, police treated missing person inquiries as differently. They used to think, well, maybe she's just gone, left her husband, and it was almost thought of as nobody else's business.
Dix watched silently from the sidelines throughout October. Police, neighbours and family searched for Pia. Mary Redfers had just moved to Gloucestershire. Their corner of the Forest of Dean was quiet and safe, the perfect place to raise her children.
I love the peacefulness of it, and in the spring it's full of bluebells. It's lovely, and it's a very, very old wood, this. It's called Carter's Grove because they used to stop here on the way to market where there was water for the cattle and spend the night here. I think that's what happened. But it's a very, very old wood. It's very special, and it's just beautiful.
The Forest of Dean, as Dix would have known, was also a perfect place to bury a body. On October 20th, Mary was walking through the grove. It was unseasonably warm, and Mary and her young children were exploring the area.
When my children were younger, we did come quite often, when the bluebells were out especially. But on that particular day, it was because of the young trees that I came. But it's lovely, and it's peaceful, and there's a lot of birds down here. And as you feel it's an ancient woodland somehow.
Mary saw something that haunts her to this day.
We were just on the way through. It was a bit overgrown, and then in front of me was this pile of branches.
Poorly hidden amongst the undergrowth, a woman's body. It was Pia Overbury.
I just saw these legs, which looked exactly as if they'd got lisle stockings on, sticking out under the branches. I thought, oh God, what on earth? And then I saw that I could see the head.
Trying not to panic the children, Mary got out of the woods as fast as she could.
When I realised what it was, my first thought was I must get the children out of here.
Glyn Dix had killed for the first time, but this man made for murder was far from finished. One day, he would marry Hazel.
Although he is perfectly capable of living out convincingly this romantic fantasy over a prolonged period of time with Hazel, that fantasy is always going to be precarious because he remains somebody who is not fully in touch with reality, who does not think in the same way that you or I think.
Mary Redfers raced home, frightened for her life.
This would have been a terrible shock for Mary, just going out for a walk with her children to find a body. She rushes straight off and raises the alarm.
I was frightened because you think, oh my gosh, is there somebody behind a tree, and you try not to get into a panic because you've got to move quickly without falling over or something. And with the two children, one of which was quite small, it was quite difficult.
Despite her fear, she remembers to mark the spot where she had stumbled on the body of Pia Overbury, so helping guide police to the gruesome scene.
I tied my green scarf onto one of the trees so we'd remember. Then, of course, when the police came, I knew exactly where it was.
This is now a murder inquiry. They are interviewing local residents, they're interviewing the tenants at the properties.
And they will interview Glyn Dix.
One person that they were inevitably going to speak to was the tenant with whom she had issues. He wasn't a prime suspect, no one was. He was just one of the people on the list.
After Pia's body is found, Dix becomes a suspect because she knew him, he was in debt to her, and he became more and more concerned about the suspicions of the police. He was interviewed, he didn't like that.
His reaction to being spoken to by the police was so extreme that he went from there, amongst everyone else, to the very top of the list of suspects.
Evidence begins to mount.
Well, there's a fingertip search going through the area where Pia's body was found. Now, this is a very meticulous exercise with a large number of officers on their hands and knees going through the undergrowth of that woodland. Now, during this, they find Pia's handbag. And more importantly than that, whilst going through, they find a .410 shotgun cartridge. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. This is evidence. This is really hard, crucial evidence, because a particular bullet, a particular cartridge, can be matched precisely and forensically to any particular firearm.
Pia's strange, unnerving tenant is now the prime suspect in her murder.
Now, Dix can't handle this. The stress is far too much for him.
Police arrive at his home to interview him under caution. Dix responds in dramatic fashion.
He takes an overdose and he's taken to hospital.
When he gets to hospital, his behaviour becomes really concerning. It's very erratic and strange. People start worrying that he's not thinking properly, responding properly. So he actually ends up in a psychiatric unit.
While in hospital, after his unsuccessful attempt to take his own life, police and doctors observe troubling signs of Dix's mental state.
His mind is literally flitting from one fictional narrative to another in response to whatever situation he finds in. There's no system, there's no organisation, there's no framework, there's no plan, there's no strategy within this individual.
He showed some symptoms looking like those of schizophrenia at that time.
Doctors agree to let police again question Dix. This time, he does not try to protest his innocence.
He broke down, he confessed, and he took them to where that firearm was.
Glyn Dix admitted to shooting his landlady, but his motive baffles police. Dix tells a confusing story of a contract killing gone wrong. He claims Pia had asked him to kill her husband. Then the story changes. Pia's marriage was abusive and he was trying to help her. Detectives realise that neither story is true. Expert analysts point to a man whose mental issues make him very dangerous.
Glyn Dix doesn't know who he is or what he is. All he has to present to the world are the narratives, the fiction, the stories he sees around and about. Now, so when he draws on one of these, he's able to act it out in a very effective manner because he is totally absorbed by it, believing it. It's all he is. So in a sense, it is genuine.
He truly believed that he was involved in a contract killing. So as his mental state deteriorated, he himself gave different explanations at different times as his mind shifted from increasingly bizarre and strange ideas.
Regardless of the motivation, police have their man.
The evidence is now overwhelming. They have Dix's confession. They have the firearm. He's taken them to it. He's shown them where it is. They have the bullet that they found at the scene, which is now forensically linked to that firearm. It's a slam dunk case. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, he has no alternative, and in July 1980 he pleads guilty to murder and is sentenced to life imprisonment.
It would be 20 years before he'd be considered for parole. While in jail, guards and inmates see a different side to Glyn Dix.
Now, all through his prison life, he seems to have stayed under the radar.
Now that's presumably because he was under medical supervision all the time and was taking his medication.
And although for some, being in prison makes the symptoms much worse, paradoxically, for some patients, they do actually improve. Sometimes the illness gets picked up and the circumstances in prison actually can be beneficial.
Maybe the prison system, with its routines and, lack maybe of external anxiety-producing sort of stimuli, maybe that suited him. Maybe he's very suited to that kind of prison environment.
Medicated, in a routine, Glyn Dix seems far from a natural-born killer.
It's very difficult to understand the type of danger that somebody like Glyn Dix poses because it's not the type of danger we normally associate with violent murderers. He's not somebody with a hostile, aggressive, vindictive personality. He's not somebody who's looking to impose power or control over others and seeking opportunities for murder or being ready to act in a violent and aggressive way. That isn't who he is. He doesn't have that way of thinking in his head.
Andrew Fisher, QC, would one day represent Glyn Dix.
Mr. Dix was a long-term schizophrenic, and as is not uncommon with schizophrenics, they're fine when they're on their medication.
Dix was eventually moved to a minimum security jail, and so began the process which led to him meeting Hazel Griffin, mother of Adam, who was serving time for traffic offences. Grateful for a new friend, Adam introduces Dix to his mother.
So this is how he gets introduced to Hazel. They spark up a relationship.
And I think that's what we see with somebody like Glyn Dix. It's much harder to pick up on that potential when you're presented with somebody who really doesn't have the personality or the apparent motivation to murder.
Dix had not told Adam or Hazel the truth about Pia Overbury's death.
Dix tells her some quite bizarre stories about how Pia died.
Dix seemed determined to woo Hazel. Did he have an agenda?
He was probably thinking about what life was going to be like when he actually did get out of prison. He needed to start laying the groundwork for, where he was going to live, who was going to look after him, who was going to look after his every need. So in that way, he probably targeted Hazel. She may have been lonely. She may just have, again, been the victim of an arch manipulator.
Hazel did not know about the true nature of his crimes. The man who was now her fiancé is the man of her dreams. She wanted to believe what he was telling her.
Despite the fantastical nature of this elaborate, ridiculous story, Hazel was in too deep. She bought it, and she was taken in by it.
He's got no other focus in his life. He can focus everything on Hazel. He can make her feel like a queen. He can make her feel like she's the only person in his life, because the fact is, she is.
But I think it's entirely understandable that Hazel would not have seen anything dangerous or vindictive in Glyn, and instead would have seen a romantic, likeable individual, because in some ways that is what he was. That is the storyline that he would have been acting out in his relationship with her.
If Hazel or her family had any fears about the new man in her life, they pushed them aside and began planning an unconventional wedding.
On the 5th of September 1999, whilst Dix was on day release, he married his fiancée. They had a nice ceremony. Family report that this was a nice day. It was a pleasant wedding. He behaved like the perfect gentleman, and the family seemed to be coming round and accepting him.
2 years later, Glyn Dix was released, and the couple were finally able to begin their life together.
In 2001, after 20 years in prison, Dix is released on life licence. Now, this is not an entire release from prison. He is subject to recall at any second. Any small infraction on his conditions of release, he can be recalled to prison. So he would be living with this over his head like the sword of Damocles.
He had been medicated. He had received all of the treatment that he can receive. And as a society, we work on the basis that everyone's redeemable. And for 20 years, he proved himself redeemable. And so the system deemed him no longer dangerous, and the system released him. And as a person who works within that system, we have to accept that the system is not always right. And in this case, it was not right.
They settle down in a house in Redditch. He's completely accepted by the family, and they just seem like a normal married couple.
Everybody in the new couple's life seemed willing to accept Dix as a reformed man.
I don't think for a second he's changed. I think he's waiting for his opportunity to arise.
He'd killed before. Was Glyn Dix a man made for murder not once, but twice? If so, Hazel may have been ill-equipped to spot the signs.
I believe he wasn't in touch with reality. He was nonetheless not completely without intelligence, which is a strange combination, and which produced somebody who was able to convincingly live out a fantasy role with Hazel for a prolonged period of time.
Glyn Dix and Hazel began their married life in the Worcestershire town of Redditch. If their new neighbours were unaware of Glyn's history, there was nothing about his behaviour that would give him away.
They were described by everybody as being this absolutely wonderful couple. Not just Hazel. It wasn't, well, she's lovely, but look at the husband. They were very popular. They were very well regarded. Everyone thought that they were effectively the perfect couple. And they lived together as a perfect couple for 3 years.
He was carrying on with his life very properly. There was no question, for instance, of any domestic violence or any trouble between he and his wife, Hazel. Indeed, they were regarded by everyone as being the perfect couple, the lovey-dovey couple.
For 2 years, Hazel and Glyn Dix lived happily together. But without prison doctors monitoring his mental health, how long could that last?
In my opinion, he hasn't changed at all. The medication may be keeping a lid on him, but to me, he's just a bomb waiting to go off.
He thought that he was well, and plainly he'd stopped taking his medication.
I think in probably the last year they were together, his mind is progressively deteriorating and he's getting sicker and sicker. And sadly, nobody's picking this up.
In fact, life as a free man came with new challenges, ones that Dix had not faced in his 20 years of incarceration.
I would question whether the relationship was functioning normally. There's lots of things we know about Dix which suggest that could never happen. I think that To live with, Hazel would have found him challenging and difficult. But he had on his side that he'd spent the last 20 years in prison. Perfect excuse for all these strange behaviours that she probably thought, yeah, fair enough, he needs to readjust. He's had a difficult life. The outside is something new to him.
He's in a new environment. He stopped taking his medication. Did Hazel know? Probably not. So she would not have known of the growing danger that she faced from her husband, the killer.
It's not uncommon for people who are on long-term medication that their partners or those who live with them don't necessarily know whether they're taking the medication, whether they're taking the proper dosage at the right time. And it may well be that his wife was alert to that, but she may not have realised quite how ill he was or what the effects of that would be.
Although he is perfectly capable of living out convincingly this romantic fantasy over a prolonged period of time with Hazel, that fantasy is always going to be precarious because he remains somebody who is not fully in touch with reality, who does not think in the same way that you or I think. And that distortion of reality, that lack of rational thought can be exposed and will be exposed in sudden and surprising and overwhelming ways.
Hazel's son Adam may also have been oblivious to how unhinged his stepfather had become, until, that is, one humid, stormy afternoon 3 years after Dix's release from prison.
On Saturday the 19th of June 2004, his old cellmate, Adam, goes to visit his mum at Seymour Drive in Redditch.
And he can't get in. So he knocks the door, there's no answer, and so he phones. And Dix answers the phone and says, "Oh yeah, come round the back, come in, come on in."
The gate's locked, which is unusual because it never is. So he phones the house. Dix answers the phone and says, "Yeah, I'm in, come round." So he does go round.
He came round to the back of the house, looked through the kitchen window where he saw Mr. Dix.
The sight that greeted him was frankly absolutely horrific.
Adam is met with a scene of utter carnage. Dix is naked. There is blood everywhere.
Terrified of what he might see on the other side of the door, Adam makes his way into his mum's kitchen.
Adam came round the back of the house, having been out, looked through the kitchen door, which was glazed or semi-glazed, saw Mr. Dix naked, astride something and lots of blood, and only realised what it was when he saw his mother's severed head on the kitchen floor.
Dix had killed Hazel, but not only had he killed her, he had dismembered and mutilated her body and was still in the process of interacting with Hazel's body, naked himself, covered in blood.
His mother has been murdered and dismembered. Her body parts are in bags. Her heart is in the freezer. A scene of unimaginable horror.
It was a scene that defied belief, as did Dix's words when Adam walked into the room.
When Dix is aware that Adam is in the kitchen with him, he looks at him and simply says, "We've had an argument."
He says that the reason that he killed Hazel was that they had an argument over the TV channel.
One of them wanted to watch the football, one of them wanted to watch the wrestling.
It's almost like he's getting some perverse joy from, look at the chaos that I've done, that I'm in the middle of, and see how I'm belittling it by saying, "Oh, it's just an argument, what's your problem?"
Suddenly, this unimportant source of annoyance exposes the psychotic aspect of Glyn Dix, and we see him responding as he did previously in this impulsive, instinctive way to a very simple, very trivial annoyance. Suddenly we see that this is not somebody who is grounded in reality.
Adam fled the house in horror, called the police. They were on the scene in minutes.
Dix appears relaxed, unfazed, calm. It's almost like this is normal. He doesn't try to run away, he doesn't try to flee. He just sits and waits.
He admitted his responsibility, absolutely. There was no question of him trying to get out of it at all.
And in the aftermath of the murder, we see very clearly just how mentally ill Glyn Dix is. We find him chopping up the woman he has apparently loved for a number of years into little pieces and talking about the fact that they've had a little argument.
But when officers arrived, Dix told them something else, something that made even less sense.
He said that she liked things tidy and he was cleaning up. Now, two statements. One is he says he's been provoked by an argument over a TV channel. The second, he says something which to most people, apart from a psychiatrist, is totally bizarre. He says he is tidying up. He's standing with a knife in his hand when Adam finds him. He's covered in blood, and there are Hazel body parts about.
Whilst this seems a frenzied, brutal, horrific attack, which it clearly is, there also seems to be an element of thought, of care, of a systematic approach by Dix to this unimaginable horror.
In dismembering the body, he says that he was tidying up. He's doing this because she liked things tidy. Now, that is a particular form of thinking that you see in some patients when they are really severe and acutely psychotic. It's a sort of form of distortion of the logic. So it's logical to him, but actually he's killing her, he's just dismembering her body. And there's something almost dreamlike about it.
With Dix taken into secure custody, officers were able to examine the scene and what remained of 54-year-old Hazel's body. They would need to make sense of the carnage that they surveyed before deciding what to do with Glyn Dix. Was this man in the midst of a psychotic breakdown, or was there something even darker going on?
Subsequently, there have been a lot of indications that this may be far worse than that, far more ritualistic than that, because there are a lot of indications that, in fact, as part of Glyn Dix's schizophrenia, he had developed an extreme form of Satanism.
So the ritualistic, Satanistic material that we know he was exposed to would have been incredibly destructive and powerful and would have taken a real hold on his mind.
Just 5 years after their unconventional jailhouse wedding, Glyn and Hazel Dix's marriage ended in brutality.
What we know is that in the course of a normal domestic day, something triggers Glyn Dix to stab Hazel and then to effectively chop her body up. Almost ritual butchery.
Was this inevitable? A key question for investigators was whether Glyn Dix was so mentally damaged that he did not know what he was doing. That his illness made him kill Hazel. So technically, he might not be guilty of murder. It matters in cases like that of Glyn Dix. The answer might reduce an offence to manslaughter, offering the remotest possibility that he may be released again at some time in the distant future. Evidence of planning would suggest murder rather than manslaughter. Was that available?
Whilst this was clearly a horrifically frenzied attack that caused such carnage, such devastating, unmitigated horror, there were elements and evidence here of a systematic approach.
He had taken Hazel's heart, he had taken it from her body, and he had placed it in the freezer.
The placement of the tools, the way the body was decapitated, the way the head was removed, the way the organs were removed. This shows an unbelievable attitude to this act of killing.
Dix told police he'd done that to preserve his wife.
There's just a glimpse of his awareness that he's done something really bad. In the way he says, we've had a little argument. The way in which he's chopping up the body is like a child chopping up plasticine. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, we really see just how far away from reality his understanding of the world is.
Police began to notice other possible motives behind Dix's actions.
There is a Satanist salute which involves the two outer fingers. And when he was cutting up Hazel's body, Glyn Dix formed her hand into that salute by removing the fingers that weren't part of the salute.
He's described as painting bizarre paintings on the wall that have sinister implication.
He had done some very strange things, especially in artwork and things around the house.
He's been reading the book of Revelations. Interesting how often Revelation seems to feature in the minds of people with schizophrenia when they become severely psychotic.
The more emotionally stimulating, the more physically arousing, the more dramatic, the more primitive the imagery or the influence that he's exposed to, the more powerful an effect it would have had on somebody like Glyn Dix. So the ritualistic, Satanistic material that we know he was exposed to would have been incredibly destructive and powerful and would have taken a real hold on his mind.
It's quite likely that at one stage he actually identified himself as the Beast 666, and so he actually has to carry out what he has read about in the most awful, graphic way for the evil one. And so that is what's actually driving him.
Had Dix willingly become a follower of Satan, or was he a victim of his own damaged mind? Perhaps both. Imagery that he had painted on walls was revealing to Donna Young's. They suggest a weak, deeply susceptible mind.
Images like the dragon that we know he had a huge image of in his kitchen, in the room where he murdered Hazel. Images like that, characters like that, give life to, give a way of activating the adult feelings that he has had no capacity to go forward with. The moment he was exposed to any images, ideas, influences, stories that in any way glorified or presented as exciting or arousing violence, then I think at some stage it was inevitable that he would act that material out.
When he took on Glyn Dix's case, barrister Andrew Fisher too believed firmly that his client was suffering from a break with reality. He was mad, not bad.
I was first instructed, I would think, a few weeks after the murder had taken place. It was plain that he was severely mentally ill.
It was Fisher who pushed for Dix to undergo psychiatric assessment.
The very facts of the offence itself were so bizarre and unusual that it could only have been committed by someone who was seriously mentally ill, in my view. I'm not a doctor, but that was my amateur view. And so my instructing solicitors, though, had already obtained a medical report, but that report had been obtained from the hospital that had released him from his previous sentence. And it suggested that there was nothing wrong with him.
This may have been true in 2001 when Hazel met Dix and a parole board had signed off on his release from prison.
Essentially, to get out, he's going to have to show that he is mentally stable and demonstrate that he no longer poses a risk to the public.
But Dix was taking regular medication under the supervision of prison guards.
The medication would have been to keep his illness suppressed.
Without drugs, as he was when on the outside, Dix was a killer.
That had its effect, that the schizophrenia coming back, and became severely mentally ill and became psychotic.
There was a lot of evidence to suggest that Dix had been so deranged that his actions when killing Hazel were not those of a sane person. But as the case was about to begin, with the vital question to be debated in court, Glyn Dix was not interested in using his apparent insanity to defend his actions.
I went and had a conference with him at Long Lartin prison where he was being held in custody. And again, he was utterly mortified. He didn't really wish to discuss it. He just kept on repeating how much he regretted it and how sorry he was. As his legal representatives, we weren't sure that that was the right outcome. So the options were, he was either guilty of murder, providing he knew what he was doing and he had proper responsibility for what he was doing, or he was guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility because his responsibility was diminished by reason of his mental illness, or he was not guilty by reason of insanity because he just didn't know what he was doing.
It's very obvious to me that he was floridly psychotic, and the insanity is a legal term.
What happened was, when the first hearing before the court, I informed the judge that we, meaning the whole of his legal team, were not satisfied about his mental health, and therefore we needed reports before we could progress with the case. But Mr. Dix himself wasn't having any of that, and he stood up in the dock and then told the judge he was pleading guilty, admitted the offence, and that was that.
On the 16th of December 2005, a judge at Birmingham Crown Court accepted Glyn Dix's guilty plea.
The judge then stated that he took the view that he couldn't prevent the defendant from pleading guilty, even though we weren't satisfied about his mental health.
The judge's primary concern is that Dix is of a major risk to the public. But I think that most people looking at this case will say, my goodness me, he's done it 20 years ago and he's gone and done it again. So the judge's main concern is that he is to protect the public. Now, the best way to be entirely sure is to give him a whole life sentence.
All the time, of course, it was acknowledged that there was no way that he would ever be released from whatever institution he was held in, whether it was a hospital or a prison. If he'd been found not guilty by reason of insanity, he would have been sent to a mental hospital with a restriction not to be released, other than with the consent of the Home Secretary, who would never agree to release him, obviously, because of his history and the fact he previously committed a killing before this one.
He now becomes one of the few convicted British criminals who will never, ever see the light of day again.
Shortly after his sentencing, prison authorities reached the same conclusion as barrister Andrew Fisher. Jail was not the right place for Glyn Dix.
Prison authorities immediately said, this man's seriously mentally ill, and he was shipped off to Ashworth Hospital, which is one of the special hospitals, one of the 3 special hospitals, Broadmoor, Rampton and Ashworth in Liverpool. On his reception into Ashworth Hospital, they realised he was seriously mentally ill.
I believe that Dix ended up in the right place.
Hazel left behind 6 children who never truly got the answers they deserved for why Dix did what he did. Had she unwittingly married a man who was naturally made for murder? Perhaps. Or perhaps he was one highly susceptible to the wrong influences.
In his rawest form, no, he doesn't have the personality traits or the aggressive interpersonal styles or the desire to cause pain. He doesn't have that. And yet, because of the susceptibility of his mind, because he has no contact with reality, Glyn Dix did and always does represent a danger to anybody in contact with him. At any moment, a seemingly unimportant source of frustration can and could trigger an impulsive, defensive, aggressive reaction.
Whatever the reason, the scars left by Hazel's brutal murder have never healed.
Tragically, 10 years after this event, Adam died. He never got over this. We must imagine what it must have been like for him to see his mother for the last time in the circumstances which he did. He never recovered, and he died aged 39.
One can't possibly envisage what effect that must have on someone for the rest of their lives. I don't imagine he was able ever to get past that.
In accordance with his whole life tariff, Glyn Dix spent the remainder of his life securely incarcerated in Ashworth High Security Hospital. He died there in 2014 at the age of 60.